zirvemizin son oturumuna başlıyoruz. Konuşmalarda da değinildi. Sektörün imajını biraz daha güçlendirmek niyeti kuvvetli. Burada da sosyal performansa bakacağız. Artık madenciliğin en kritik unsurlarından birisi olarak öne çıkıyor ve bu özel oturumda sahadaki ilişkilerden risk yönetimine, toplumsal güvenin güçlendirilmesinden paydaş iletişimine kadar madencilik işletmelerinin sürdürülebilirliğini doğrudan etkileyen konuları ele alacağız. İki önemli isim sahnede olacak. Oturumun moderasyonunu Türkiye Madenciler Derneği Başkanı Sayın Mehmet Yılmaz yapacaklar. Konuşmacımız uzaklardan geldi. Steyn, Reddy Associates'in kurucu direktörü Sayın Mike Steyn'i alkışlarınızla sahneye davet ediyorum. Buyurunuz, söz sizde Sayın Başkanım.
Herkese tekrar merhaba. Günün bu saatinde son bölümde herkesin halen ilgiyle izliyor olması gerçekten çok iyi. Neticede biz bu 4 Aralıklarda yaptığımız etkinliklerde ilgiyi ve alakayı gerçekten tutabiliyor olmanın keyfini hep yaşıyoruz. Sona kalan oturumlarda genelde bu tür şeyler hep olur. Ancak bu gerçekten çok güzel bir gösterge. Salonun ilgisi, alakası açısından hepinize tekrar teşekkür ederek başlıyorum. Bugün sevgili Mike Steyn'le son oturumda ele alacağımız konu gerçekten önemli. Ben hızlıca kendisini tanıtayım size. Mike Steyn Reddy Associates, SRA'in hem kurucu direktörü hem de CEO'su. Özellikle stakeholder engagement'ta, bu toplumsal kanaat önderlerinin oluşturulmasında, sosyal etkide, risk ve fırsat değerlendirmelerinde, önleyici planlama alanlarında ve onun uygulamasında yetkin ve son derece derin bir tecrübeye sahip. Yaklaşık 30 yıllık bir global tecrübesi var. Yaklaşık 35 ülkede 50 değişik projede çalışmış. Türkiye'de de çalışmış. Yıllarca Türk Stream projesinde, TANAP'ta, madencilik sektöründe tek tek saymak istemiyorum şu anda. Best Practice Solution dediğimiz, yani en iyi pratik çözümler anlamında oluşan ciddi bir tecrübesi var. Projeden projeye değişen veya sahipliklere, bu projelerin sahibi olan grupların özelliklerine göre değişen çözüm önerileriyle biliniyor. Ben tekrar geldiği için kendisine çok teşekkür ederek kendisini bu şekilde tanıttıktan sonra işin açıkçası kendisine sunumu için biz önce bir sunumunu izleyelim. Sonra ben de kendisine bazı sorularla yaptığı sunumunu daha açma fırsatı vermek üzere zamanımı bekliyor olacağım. Mike, over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Tanaiden. Firstly, it's my pleasure and privilege to be here today to present to you, and I appreciate the invite from the association. Hello to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, members of the association, government officials, friends and colleagues. I see familiar faces here from my time working on various projects in Turkey. And as has been described, I'm going to talk on the topic of managing your social risks and managing social performance. And I'm sorry, I'm going to ask the gentleman to move a little bit across because he's in front of my screen there. The risks of failure and some key steps as you embark on this journey to implement the Towards Sustainable Mining initiative. So I'll spend about 30 minutes just giving you a presentation with a bit of an introduction, talking about social performance, what are the risks and opportunities, what is the challenge that you face, and then firstly for, as we say, the big bosses, some things that we suggest you need to bear in mind when you try and optimize your social performance, and then for those of you who are the social managers and practitioners, some of the actions that you can take and some of the things that you need to bear in mind. A few closing remarks, and then of course we'll go into the moderated question time. Again, thanks for the kind introduction. Suffice it to say that I've worked extensively in Turkey over the years, not just in the mining sector, but also in the oil and gas sector. And what I thought was a very useful way to start this discussion was to look at this graphic. Every year there are various organizations across the globe that publish what they consider to be the key risks facing the global mining sector. And in this case, from the EI Top 10 Business Risks publication, what they have put up as the top risks facing your mining sector in 2026, okay? And I'll just read from here because the text is a bit small. What I think is important to note is how social impacts many of these risks, okay? Operational complexity, you face that on many fronts, but the social layer, your interaction with communities makes that even more challenging. The rising costs and productivity challenges you face are again impacted by your interactions with the communities that you neighbor, that you draw your labor from. The capital that you need to develop your projects, increasingly Equator Principal banks and other banks are requiring improved social performance to enable you to access capital. Your resources and reserves are impacted if you cannot have access to the land that you need because you have social problems. That directly impacts the reserves that you have. Obviously, your social license to operate above and beyond your legal license is directly a function of the quality of your relations with your neighboring communities. Your workforce, as I said, often you draw them from your local communities. So again, that impacts on your ability to optimize performance. Sustainability, sustainable outcomes, social, as I'll talk more, has a direct impact on your ability to do that. And then the last one at the bottom there, changing business models. Increasingly, we see this at a number of different levels, whether it's increased shareholdings that governments take in projects, whether communities have a direct interest in a project, the joint venture operations that you often enter into to develop projects, all of those social has an impact on. And that impact can be either negative or positive. Obviously, we want it to be positive. So, in terms of consequences of poor social performance, and I think it's really important, how do we quantify this so that those who maybe doubt the role of social understand how it can have a direct impact on your business? And firstly, it negatively impacts your social license to operate. And I can think of many examples across the globe where companies have had their operations disrupted because of poor social performance. And that has, of course, had a direct effect on the bottom line in terms of time and money. It negatively impacts the sustainability of your business, the mitigation measures that you put in place to address your negative impacts on communities, and benefit sharing. Again, I can think of numerous projects across the globe. A particular one, a big mining company in Peru, where they were unable to extend the life of that mine because they were unable to access the land where this expansion deposit was located because of community opposition. So some of the possible negative consequences can, of course, be an impact in the form of impoverishment of communities whose land or where they are living, where they get moved and they don't get treated properly, that can lead to that impoverishment for them. And the result of that is, of course, negative publicity. I recently worked on a project in Mexico where these two communities had been impacted. The impacts hadn't been addressed. They took the company to court. They went to the United Nations. And eventually, enough bad publicity was focused on the company where they had to then go back and deal with those legacy issues. Mine owner reputation, what I would call lost opportunity cost. And there are a number of well-publicized examples across the globe. You all know, I've probably heard of the Roșia Montană project in Romania, which has never been able to be developed by the company that owns that deposit because of bad community and government perception about the project. We are all aware of what happened some years back in Brazil with the Brumadinho dam collapse and the consequences that that has had for the project proponents. Recent court rulings in the hundreds of millions of dollars about, the consequences for the company in terms of lost production, but of course then now these damages. Fundamentally for you as operators, the effect on your mine development schedule, your mine operational schedule, and your budgets if social delays delay your projects. Again, I can think of numerous examples, but if you quantify the cost of a week of standing time of construction contractors on a project, or a week of lost production, those are very hard numbers, and they can be huge numbers, and they pale into insignificance the actual costs of doing social properly. As I mentioned, loss of reserves, resources, and even the whole asset. Again, I mentioned the project Roșia Montană in Romania. There are many other examples of projects that have either lost access to the whole deposit or lost access or had delayed access to a deposit. And that has a direct consequence on the bottom line for the project developer and for the share price, for example, of the company. And that was my last point. Mine value and share price can be fundamentally negatively impacted. There are numerous examples across the globe. Some I won't mention because of confidentiality. I won't mention the names. But I've worked on many of those and are dealing with many of those as we speak. And what is really, I think, apart from the bottom line impact on time and money, what has really manifested the negative consequences is the amount of time that management of those companies has had to now spend trying to address these issues in retrospect. Instead of having avoided those issues, now, instead of spending time on other things that they have to do, senior management, right up to the level of the board, CEOs, chief operating officers, having to go back and deal with these legacy issues because they are having a negative effect on the company's operations or their reputation. But of course, it doesn't have to be like that. And I want to talk a little about the good consequences of good social performance. So I think the umbrella for that is clearly improved overall business performance. You are not doing this just because you want to be nice. Okay? You are not doing this just because government tells you to do this. You are not doing this because the Towards Sustainable Mining initiative suggests that it is a good idea. It has a direct positive impact on your bottom line. And a number of speakers have referenced that, and Catherine talked about some examples, for example, the Philippines. So what are those? It can help you manage your business complexity. The fact is, mining across the world operates in a very complex environment. And having stakeholders like the communities, supportive of your projects, governments more supportive of your projects, is going to help to navigate the challenges you face. Access to land and water. If you don't have access to land, you have no mine. If you don't have access to water, you don't have a mine. Those resources are increasingly challenged. They're increasingly competed over across the globe. And therefore, having access to them on time to build your project, to operate it peacefully, is critical. I talked about access to finance. The Equator Principal banks now requiring improved environmental and social performance, and according to the IFC social performance standards and environmental performance standards, showing that you can meet those standards will improve your access to capital. Access to markets. Of course, if you want to raise money, you list on the stock exchanges, you raise money through private equity, and again, the standards that are being required on the social and environmental front are being raised all the time. Critically, of course, good social performance helps ensure against business disruption. And that can be in the form of delays, cost overruns. And so you want to treat your local communities, those social partners of yours, almost as your first line of defense. If they know that you are doing things to the best of your ability, when outside parties come in and criticize what you're doing, the fact that you've proved to the communities and to government your good intent through words and commitments and actions, that is a first line of defense for you. And of course, you're going to meet your legal requirements. And not only your legal requirements, the requirements of, for example, the Towards Sustainable Mining initiative. And I think this can all ultimately positively impact on your market value, your share price, the value that someone is going to be willing to pay for you if they want to acquire your company. And then, of course, all of this gives you the opportunity to differentiate from your competitors. So I'm convinced through my experience that this can have a direct positive impact on your business bottom line. So what is the challenge? There's been a lot of discussion today about the importance of good social standards. Okay, and we've talked about the IFC performance standards, the TSM initiative, and clearly all of those help improve business outcomes. I know there's been discussion today also about this consolidation of the four standards, ICMM, Goldmark, and the like. Again, that is a very important step because, as Ercan Bey had mentioned, a lot of companies were faced with confusion. All of these standards, let's simplify things. So that is a very important initiative. And of course, tailoring the TSM initiative to the circumstances of Turkey is another critical step. However, what I really want to talk about is the fact that TSM adoption, adaptation, and rollout in Turkey is not going to be enough on its own. I would suggest to you that your real challenge or the real question that you face to operationalize the TSM requirements and to improve your social performance on the ground in a practical, locally appropriate manner, that is the challenge, okay? You have to be able to take those standards and requirements and protocols and apply them on the ground at your operations. And you have to do it in a practical way. You have to do it in a way that's appropriate to your local context. Okay? Otherwise, it's going to be a paper exercise. It's not going to make a business or enough of a difference to your bottom line. And I would suggest to you that this requires you optimizing how you do the following aspects of your business. Stakeholder engagement, social assessment and planning, social implementation, and then, of course, social monitoring and evaluation and reporting. And again, reporting, for example, into the TSM initiative. So let's discuss some of those key steps and things to bear in mind in these areas. And firstly, I wanted to talk to the big bosses in the room, those owners and CEOs and COOs and board members of the mining companies that are members of the association. And I would want to distill it down to, from your perspective, I think 4 important aspects. Firstly, understanding. Secondly, roles and resourcing. Thirdly, internal engagement and alignment, and performance. And let's look at understanding first. What I would say to you is that the key thing to understand is that social performance is integral to business success, and poor performance is costly. It directly affects your bottom line. I've talked about that already. Secondly, social performance is not about public relations. Public relations are important for your business, but they are not a substitute for the measures associated with social performance. Social performance is not about lots of talking and handing out lots of money. What's critical is the social function needs to be run as professionally as the rest of your business. And there is a clear business case for optimizing your social performance through tailoring and rolling out the TSM and taking the practical steps I'm going to recommend. Secondly, roles and resourcing. This will not be possible in your organization unless you put in place a clear organizational chart with clear roles and reporting and cooperation lines at site and corporate level. Your social manager should be site-based, they should be senior, and they should directly report to your general manager or CEO, as the case may be. And make sure you hire suitably qualified, experienced, and equipped people. The social function is not where you put the problem human resource manager or the problem exploration manager. It's a function in and of its own with its own skills and requirements and needs to be treated as such. And then I really want to talk about something that I feel is really important, is internal engagement and alignment. Social is actually the responsibility of all of the departments in your operation. It is not just the responsibility of your social or community relations department. And if you want to make this work, what you need to do is facilitate or put in place measures to facilitate across your project, across your mine, discussion and cooperation mechanisms that help you to manage and report on social issues. Put those mechanisms in place so that your departments can work well with each other. And then critically, ensure that your social work plan aligns with your overall project and mine timeline, your work plan and milestones. Social should not just be out there as a nice thing you do because people are pestering you from the community. It should be linked to your overall project and mine work plan and schedule. It should directly relate to those. It should perform to help you achieve what you want to do as a mining project. You're not there as a social project. You're there as a mining project. You have social responsibilities, but your social spend should input into achieving your mining objectives as well. And then, of course, like performance across your business, insist on excellence and meeting deadlines. And I would suggest one way to achieve this is to link all management bonuses to include a social performance KPI. So those are a few words of advice to as I say, the big bosses. Let's talk a little bit about what social practitioners, social managers can focus on as they try to apply the standards, the laws, the requirements of TSM, their own standards to their business on the ground. What do you need to do practically on the ground? I apologize, I'm going to look at my document here because it's a little bit small on the screen there. I've got a long list of things here that I would suggest are practical steps you can take related to your operations. I'll go through them quickly. Firstly, understand your stakeholders, not just externally, internally, okay? Understand who are your decision makers in your organization. Who do you need to engage with? Who do you need to convince about the importance of social? That internal engagement is as critical as external engagement. If you do not get that internal engagement right, you will not succeed externally. And often what I see is social practitioners, social managers, they do not speak the right language when they engage with the rest of the organization. When they engage with the CEO, the board, they don't talk a language that is meaningful to the big bosses, okay? And let's be honest, at the end of the day, for the big bosses, what are they worried about? They're worried about time, they're worried about money, and they're worried about reputation, okay? Because if they don't deliver on those things, they'll be out of a job. So if you're as a social practitioner, you need to relate to how the financial manager, the production manager, and those other people have a discussion with them, talk in a way they understand, and they'll listen more to you. And that will help ensure that senior management understanding and commitment. Social practitioners, we tend to talk a lot. We need to listen more. We need to listen more to the internal stakeholders in our organization. We need to listen more to government, the regulators, and to the communities that we interact with. And if we listen more, we'll be able to better respond. Obviously, provide appropriate, clear, and timely information to all stakeholders. Build trust. One day you will need that trust. Something will happen where you will need stakeholders to trust you. You cannot build that trust at that stage. You need to build it early for when you will need it. And that's internally and externally. I would also suggest that we all know communities we deal with, a lot of things get asked of mining companies. And it's really important because all of us have a budget to distinguish between community needs and community wants, okay? Never promise something without costing it first. I've seen too often very vague and broad promises get made to communities, and companies don't know what they cost before they promise them. The CEO, the financial manager, hasn't been consulted yet, and that's going to cause friction. And then I would suggest with your external stakeholders, don't just give. Expect something in return from your external stakeholders. This is a relationship, it's a partnership, and it's not just about giving, it's about a mutual give and take relationship. And then, of course, a good rule in any organization, externally and internally, is to under-promise and over-deliver, okay? Perception is everything. Perception is everything. And I know for a fact that many of you, as across the world, mining companies are doing many good things. They don't always get credit for them. The perception might be one that they are unhappy with, but perception is everything. So make sure you deliver what you promise. And then, of course, record engagement. Record how you engage with people, because someone will tell you later that you didn't, okay? And you've got to be able to show that you did. Track the commitments that you make. Record what you've promised to do and your progress in achieving these. When was the promise made? Who made it? By when did you seek to deliver that promise? let me talk a little bit about assessment and planning. And I know there's a lot there on the slide. I believe that you'll all have access to copies of this later. I think Catherine mentioned establishing a proper social management framework, okay? Put that framework of objectives and guiding principles and an assessment process, a series of management plans, and all of the other mechanisms in place. But of course, this starts with very, very basic things. Understand your project footprint. Understand how your project footprint can grow over time as you expand your mine. Understand your area of influence. Who are your stakeholders? And then put in place an appropriate set of meeting and other mechanisms to facilitate internal and external discussion, coordination, management, and reporting. Very, very simple tools that you can use so that you have regular interaction within your organization, within your social department, with your external stakeholders. Establish a clear social baseline. You as miners, of course, you're going to impact your environment, the communities you impact with. So you need a baseline before you start to compare with what happens when you do cause impacts and once you mitigate those impacts. As I said, put in place clear objectives and guiding principles and define what success looks like. I see so much money spent on social, but there's no clear objective. There's no definition of what success looks like. What are we trying to achieve? So put that in place so you can measure your outcomes. And then, of course, be clear on the laws and standards you need to comply with. Very importantly, benchmark. There is a lot of learning in the sector, good and bad, from past projects and from projects that you're working on. Reflect on that to help you improve. And then, of course, determine your key planning assumptions for anything you do in the social sphere so that you can know what you're dealing with. And then, of course, no matter how well you plan, things go wrong. The reality is, no matter how good your community relations are, at some point you will face an unhappy community, okay? And so scenario plan for when things go wrong. And then develop, just like the rest of the business, a clear work plan and schedule and budget for all your social activities, okay? So that you can, again, show your management that you have a clear plan for moving forward. Just a last few thoughts. Develop proper social management plans, but not as paper exercises, as management tools, just like you do in the rest of your business. Plan together with the communities and government agencies that you deal with. Ensure fairness and transparency in what you do. Put in place a good information management system. And always ask this question, is what I am doing sustainable? It doesn't help to spend a lot of money and build up expectations to do something that is not sustainable, particularly after your mine closes. What happens when you're no longer there? Are all of these things you've done sustainable? And then as you build capacity in your social management team, your social department, put in place a clear succession plan. Too often I see where a social manager comes in, they do great work, they leave the organization, and everything just collapses because there's no succession plan. There's no one in the organization to take on that work and carry it forward. And then insist on your social team bringing suggested solutions and not just problems. I don't know about any of you, but in my company, I get tired when all I get brought is problems. Bring me the problem, but bring me a suggested solution. And that's what you want from your social team. And then, like anywhere in your organization, be decisive in changing what or who is not working well. There's no room for complacency. Lastly, implementation, monitoring, and reporting. Of course, TSM initiative has its mechanisms for reporting and monitoring, and I think those are critical. But of course, you're going to need your mechanisms internally to be able to then report out externally. And always as an organization on the social front, insist on social excellence and meeting deadlines. Again, I see too often in mining companies, they're spending money on social, and it's almost like the social department spends this money with no clear deadline, no clear objectives. How does it contribute, not just to your communities and external stakeholders, to the business directly? And the way to do that, of course, to put in place clear performance indicators and clear tailored reporting mechanisms. So, just a few final thoughts. I want to emphasize to you that I believe there's a clear business case for optimizing social performance. Doing that is not just a public relations exercise. It will lead to improved outcomes for your business and improved reputation for the mining sector in Türkiye. I would also suggest to you that improving social performance is not as hard as you think. There are practical steps you can take that will have measurable differences. As was said, it's not going to happen overnight, but it will start to happen, and you will see the change. So ultimately, hire the right social people, resource them properly, and give them support from your other departments. And this will ultimately help facilitate more transparency to your stakeholders about your business. So I've kept it practical. If you do these things on the ground, I believe it will filter up into how you can then show clear improvement through the TSM process and in your interactions with stakeholders. And I hope you find that valuable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. So I'll switch back to Turkish because most of the audience are Turkish. Soru var mı arkadaşlar Mike Bey'e sormak istediğiniz? Yoksa benim kafamda planladığım birkaç tane soru var. Bir iki de tespitte bulunmak isteyeceğim ama eğer soracak sorularınız varsa kartlarla yazıp gönderebilirsiniz. Öncelikle bu kapsamlı, güzel sunumu için Mike'a çok teşekkür ediyorum. Ben şöyle söyleyeyim, aşağı yukarı madencilik sektörüne girdiğimde 24 yaşındaydım, şimdi 61 yaşındayım. İlk 5 yılda çok bir şekilde yaşamın akışıyla bu halkla ilişkilerin tam ortasında bulduk. Biz sektör olarak, bizim kuşağımız sektör olarak kendimizi orada bulduk. İlk gösteriler, işte ilk karşı çıkışlarla başladı. Buradan başlayarak Mike'a bir soru soracağım. Hatta o günlerde, bugün salonda aramızda zannediyorum işte Sabri Bey var, o günleri çok yoğun yaşadık. Birebir her gün bu sektörün özellikle yürümesi için ciddi eforlar, ciddi çabalar sarf ettik. Allah rahmet eylesin Güven hocamız, Güven Önal hocamız. Bugün aramızda değil, eski başkanlarımızdan İsmet Kasapoğlu, hepsini anmak istiyorum. Mustafa abi, Atılgan abi, hep beraber ciddi bir mücadele verdik. Halkla ilişkilerde veyahut da bu madenlerin algısını düzeltmede çok temel olanı Mike anlattığı ana hatlarıyla. Ben burada bir soru sormak istiyorum. Biliyorsunuz madencilik şirketlerinin bugünlerde çok yaptığı ana faaliyetler veya çok önemli üzerinde durduğu faaliyetlerden bir tanesi de kurumsal sosyal sorumluluk projeleri. Yani bizim CSR dediğimiz projeler. Şimdi ben aslında biraz Mike'ın bu konu, kendi kafamda bunun nereye oturduğunun farkında olarak soruyorum ama halkla ilişkiler ve karşılığında kurumsal sosyal sorumluluk projeleri ki birazcık dokundu Mike konuşmasında. Yani sadece bir şey vermekle veya sadece bir şey yapmakla bu işin kotarılabileceğine inanmak saf dillik olur. Biraz böyle afaki olur, gerçekçi olmaz. Bu konuyu nasıl yerleştirip nasıl cevaplarsın? Aslında ben burada önceden bir şeyler hazırlamıştım ama sunumu dinleyince bu soruyla başlamak istedim.
Indeed, I think if I understand the question properly, you know, CSR projects and how do we do those well, and we don't just give, we get. You know, a factor that comes up on most projects is local employment and local procurement opportunities. And too often, what you hear from the project planners is, we'd love to hire local people, but there's no one who's skilled. We'd love to buy local products, but there's no one who's skilled to provide them. And, you know, that I see as a CSR project where you help communities to capacity build themselves. But there's a direct benefit to you as a company. It's not just about improving their chances of employability. Your ability to then hire them locally has multiple benefits for your operation. Firstly, you're hiring locally. That's often cheaper than bringing people from elsewhere. And secondly, once you have community members with vested interests in your organization, it's survival, it's prosperity, it's long-term expansion. That is the get, some of the gets that you get in return. So that would be an example where, you know, that there's a direct give and a get from what I would call a CSR program, but a concrete, practical outcomes for your external stakeholders and you as a company. And I hope I answered the question now. I had a little bit of a breakup in some of the translation.
Okay. Well, no, just to let you know, I was just trying to make sure that it's not an enough tool to make social project, but you need to have a very good community relations so that it would work together. Otherwise, it's going to be taken as wrong way.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Yani gerçekten önemli olan noktalardan bir tanesine dokundu. Ben de şöyle bir açıklamayla tamamlamak isterim. Halkla ilişkileriniz şeffaf ve iyi değilse yaptığınız hiçbir sosyal proje ya da yöreye yönelik proje yerini bulmayacaktır. Ayakları yere basmayacaktır hiçbir zaman. Çünkü aksi takdirde farklı bir algı yaratılacaktır ki biz bunu hiçbir zaman istemiyoruz. O tam tersine verimli değil, zarar verici bir şekle dönüşüyor. Teşekkür ederim. O zaman bir soru soracağım. Hiç şüphesiz işletmelerde standartlar çok önemli. Yani hava kalitesini bozmadığınız, su kalitesini bozmadığınız, toplumsal anlamda oraya bir katkı koyduğunuzun standartlarla, teknik verilerle ortaya koyulması çok önemli. Fakat bazen yöneticileri veya patronları bu sosyal ruhsat ya da sosyal onay konusuna ikna etmek çok kolay olamıyor. Ya bu da bir çok önemli önceliktir demek çok kolay olmuyor. Bunu kolaylaştırıcı bir fikri var mı Michael? Nasıl daha kolay yapabiliriz bunu? Patronları veya yöneticileri bu işe nasıl ikna edebiliriz, angaje edebiliriz?
Well, I think convincing them, and you made the point that it's easy to measure the metrics of production. You know, we produce so much, we produced at this cost per ounce of gold or whatever it is. How do you measure, how do you show quantifiable results of this money you spend on social? And often the way you prove it is almost in the negative. It's when you don't have trouble that you say, well, that is a result, partly at least, of good social performance. But I think there are ways to measure it. For example, in the uptake of local employment, perception studies that you can regularly do with communities. And in that regard, and I think the truth is we work in a tough industry. You have to develop a tough skin because you're often going to be told by communities things you don't like to hear. So notwithstanding that tough skin, not to be defensive. And I see again across the globe, companies are getting better at, and mining associations, at actually showing government, showing stakeholders how much they spend, and creating a positive result. I would say two other things I wanted to your specific question, give you as comments. You know, why is social important? Why should we as senior managers pay attention to this? Well, firstly, I mean, you've just signed up to the TSM initiative. And the reality is that that's going to ultimately lead to public disclosure of results. And I would suggest that's a pretty good incentive to start doing things on the ground to show positive outcomes. But I think the one way, and I mentioned it before, is the most effective. Take your company, take your mining project you're working on, calculate what it costs for 1 day of lost production, or 1 week of lost production, or if you're trying to build your mine or an extension to your mine, what is the cost of standby of your building contractor sitting there because they cannot get access to where they want to work because of community disruption or government shutdown because of non-compliance? That number, those numbers will scare the pants off management because they will be big numbers, okay? And I can tell you that the cost of doing social right doesn't compare to the cost of 1 month of lost production. So I think that those would be very quantifiable ways in which I think you can convince them this is worth doing properly.
Çok teşekkür ederim. Bu arada kapatmadan önce aklımdaki birkaç şeyi de sizlerle paylaşmak istiyorum. Ben toplumun içinde çok uzun yıllar sosyal işlerle ilgilenmiş bir insan olarak bizim toplumumuzda, bizim kültürümüzde, bizim geleneğimizde insanlarla birlikte olmak, onlardan farklı olmadığınızı onlara hissettirmek ve doğruyu acıtsa da sadece doğruyu söylemek çok önemli kredibilite yaratıyor. İnsanların doğum gününde, düğün gününde, ölüm gününde bu maden sahalarımızın civarındaki köyler için konuşuyorum. Bir arada olmak çok önemli. Onlara iyiyi de kötüyü de ilk ağızdan bizim söylememiz çok önemli. Ve bizim kültürümüzde yine başka bir şey var. Bu belki başka yerlerde de öyledir. Birçok şey karşılık bekleyerek yapıldığında bizim kültürümüz biraz değişik olduğu için yerini bulmayabilir. Bazı şeyleri önden ve karşılık beklemeden yapmak ve açık yüreklilikle yapmak çok önemli. Başka bir konu da yine hep aklımdadır. Netice itibariyle bizim maden sahalarımızın civarında olan köylerin madenci şirketin doğru yaptıklarını anlattığı ve sürekli vatandaşla paylaştığı bir kale olmak zorunda. Eğer boşluk bırakırsanız o boşluk bir başka güç tarafından mutlaka doldurulur ve hep de öyle olmuştur. Bu sonucunda da çok kötü sonuçlara sebep olmuştur. Dediğim gibi önce çok iyi işler yapmalıyız, doğayı temiz tutmalıyız, insanları mutlu, mesut ve güvenli şekilde çalıştırmalıyız. Ondan sonra bunun yanına belirli bizim kendi geleneklerimizin çerçevesinde kurumsal veya da sosyal bazı projeleri, katkı projelerini koymak ve en sonunda da o kredibiliteyi sürekli sabit ve 100 seviyede tutmak lazım. Yoksa 30 yılda edindiğiniz bir kredibilite 30 saniyede yok olabiliyor. Olabilecek bir yanlışlıkla, bir felaketle, Mike'ın dediği gibi o zaman çok doğru söylüyor. Yani bir ölçerseniz 1 gün, 2 gün, 1 ay ya da işte 6 ay üretimden uzak kaldığınızı bir düşünürseniz felaket ne kadar büyük bir maliyetinin olduğunu görürsünüz. Ben başka salondan soru yoksa Mike'a tekrar sorayım. İlave, do you want to add something else on top of everything that you said? Or?
I think that, I think firstly, create the mechanisms where your social team interacts with the rest of your project and organization. And to the social practitioners, think about the language and the format that you can best use to engage with your internal stakeholders. I think the last thing I would say, I've heard people say that, there's a challenge, and I've heard this in many countries. We want to improve social performance, but there's a capacity gap in the country. Where do we find these people that we can hire to help improve our social performance, to staff our social teams? Where do we find them? And I think the truth is there is this shortage, and it's a global shortage. So I would suggest that apart from you at individual organizational levels where you put in place measures to attract and capacity build people in your organization, you probably want to start looking at the association level with universities interacting to try and create the courses, the forums where you can start to develop that capacity. And I don't think it's just in relation to the social practitioners. I personally would love to see across the globe where people who go and get a mining engineering degree or a finance degree, social is a module in those degrees or qualifications where, you know, you learn a little bit about that part of the business. It's a little bit like the doctor or the lawyer you go to. They're great technically, but they don't always have the best people skills. And again, they're not taught that. So I think there's scope there at that level at the association universities to help develop these courses that, you know, will help give you the resources you need as hopefully the mining sector in Turkey continues to grow and prosper. But again, thank you for your time. I appreciate your thoughts and attendance.
Ben de teşekkür ediyorum. Son söylediklerine sonuna kadar katılıyorum. Madencilikte sosyal iletişimi sağlamanın biraz kompleks bir tarafı var. Çünkü teknik sorulara cevap verebilecek ekibiniz olması lazım. Ama aynı yüz, aynı sesi de kullanmak gerekiyor. Dolayısıyla o insanların sosyal kabiliyet ve kapasitelerinin de olması, aynı anda onların bir arada olması gerekiyor. Ben de ona göre her zaman söylerim. Tabii ki iletişimcilere ihtiyacımız var. Ama mümkünse sosyal iletişim takımı teknik background'u olan, teknik bilgisi olan, bu işin içinden gelen insanlardan olursa vatandaşa daha direkt sorularına cevap verebilir. Ben tekrar çok teşekkür ediyorum katılımı için. Çok uzaktan geldi, bizi kırmadı. Sağ olun, dinlediğiniz için sizlere de çok teşekkür ediyorum.
Bizler de çok teşekkür ediyoruz efendim Sayın Mike Steyn'e. Onlara da yine LÖSEV ve Darüşşafaka'ya yaptığımız bağışlardan bir sertifika takdim etmek istiyoruz. Kıymetli misafirler, böylece Sorumlu Madencilik Zirvemizin sonuna gelmiş bulunuyoruz. Bugün burada paylaşılan deneyimlerin, fikirlerin, yüksek standartlarda yapılan madenciliğin Türkiye'nin geleceğine yön vermesini, ilham vermesini temenni ediyoruz. Katılımınız, katkılarınız, emeğiniz için hepinize ayrı ayrı çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Şimdi saat 19'a kadar fuaye alanımızda kokteylimiz olacak. Saat 19'da Dünya Madenciler Günü'nü güzel bir gala yemeğiyle kutlayacağız. Saat 19'da görüşmek üzere, iyi akşamlar.